Continuing our look at the Zizzle Pirates of the Caribbean toy line, that brings us to our second most produced character, that being Will Turner. Now, the very first Will Turner figure produced was this one right here. Articulation-wise, it is pretty basic. You can move the arms at the shoulders, and you can bend the elbows. You can, of course, turn the waist, but not by much. And you can move the legs and swivel the head. Sculpt is all around pretty decent, especially for a figure released back in 2006. It doesn't look exactly like Orlando Bloom, but it does look pretty reminiscent. The rest of the sculpt is also pretty above average, once again for a figure produced back in 2006. The paint and, of course, the sculpting details on the outfits of the Zizzle Pirates of the Caribbean figures was always above average, in my opinion, and this figure is definitely an example of that. Accessory-wise, you just get these two swords right here. Will Turner definitely goes through a lot of different swords throughout Dead Man's Chest. A really unique feature with this figure is you can actually stick one of the swords in the sheath, which is something that isn't exactly as common as you would expect in this line. Overall, you can't go wrong with this figure. It's definitely not perfect, as I do think the proportions are a little off. His feet are definitely oversized, and he is a little bit hard to pose. His legs definitely get floppy over time. I actually have several duplicates of this figure, and they all have loose legs. But overall, for one of the earliest Zizzle Pirates of the Caribbean figures produced, it's definitely one of the better ones. Next, that brings us to Cannibal Escape Will Turner, which came in one of the deluxe sets that came with a bone cage accessory. Besides the little action piece that he was included with, this figure doesn't include any accessories. This figure definitely isn't one of my personal favorites, but he is pretty common to find. That brings us to our very last figure produced for Dead Man's Chest. Now, this figure has a very similar outfit to our previous figure that we took a look at, but similar to Final Battle Jack Sparrow, this figure is in a very exaggerated pose. Articulation-wise is no different than the other figures. You can move the shoulders, and you can move the legs, the head, the waist. The action pose definitely hinders the range of movement in the shoulder, specifically in the right arm. Accessories, we just get yet again another one of these swords. It's the same exact sword released for the very first Will Turner figure. This is definitely a very unique figure. I didn't actually own this one as a kid. This is one that I actually got a few months ago, but I'm definitely glad to have it now. Once again, it's a very unique figure. You got all the tears in his clothes, and definitely the pose is a huge highlight. And with all that out of the way, that brings us to Secrets of the Deep. Now, Secrets of the Deep only released two versions of Will Turner. We got this one right here, which is very similar to the very first Will Turner we looked at, though he has a different head sculpt, and his hair is tied up in a ponytail. Once again, articulation is pretty much the same as the other figures, though this one actually supports knee articulation. This is the only Will Turner figure to have this feature. The weapons are actually very unique with this figure. This is the first time that we see Bootstrap Bill's knife, which was given to him in Dead Man's Chest. And we also got this hatchet right here, which is painted very nicely. As for the sculpt, it is definitely an improvement over the other figures, and they could have easily reused the jacket sculpt, but this is a completely new sculpt for this figure. Everything with this figure is brand new. Very cool figure. Only downside is his sheath is closed off, and he wasn't included with a sword accessory. That brings us to one of our story pack figures. This one is somewhat hard to find. He was released with a Davy Jones figure along with a little comic book. It isn't based off of any scene in the movie particularly, though the comic book suggests that this took place right before he made it to Isla Cruces and right after the Kraken attack. It's definitely an interesting comic book. I don't suppose it was written with the intention of being canon, but I suppose you can get creative with it. It definitely gets very bizarre with Will Turner fighting a giant sea serpent. But overall, this is definitely the uniquest of the bunch. Of course, the main highlight is he's covered in all this seaweed. It isn't detachable or anything, it is just a part of the mold. And he is also covered in this glossy kind of paint, which sort of gives off the idea that he's soaking wet. It's a very similar feature to the ocean drenched Jack Sparrow figure. The sculpt is definitely not as good as some of the other figures. I think his ears look a little too big. Once again, we get one of these sword accessories. It's the exact same sculpt as our first Will Turner figure. Overall, these two figures are manageable enough to find. You can get them for around $10 to $15. Definitely some really cool figures. Finally, that brings us to At World's End. A super common figure is this Will Turner right here, and this figure comes with a variety of accessories. We first get this little sword right here, and this is an accessory that henceforth is used for every single Will Turner figure that we're going to be looking at. We also get this little pole, which you can slide onto his arms right here. This figure is supposed to represent the opening scene of At World's End, where he is tied up in Singapore. The little pole accessory is sculpted nicely. We get some good paint apps. And the last accessory that this figure comes with is the little map chart, which they use to find Jack Sparrow. And you can simply just slide it over his back. There's this little peg hole, and you can just slide it in. Figure sculpt is definitely decent, once again, for a 2007 figure. Articulation this time around is actually different. There is a ball joint in his shoulders. You can make them go up and down. His legs are hindered by his shirt piece, but you can definitely move them around decently. And then lastly, you can turn his head. Once again, this is a very common figure to find. You can actually find him as cheap as $5 to $6. I've actually found this figure on multiple occasions throughout my antique runs. Next, this brings us to, honestly, my favorite one. This is the Deluxe Pack Will Turner. He came with a little spring-loaded raft accessory. Accessory-wise, we once again get a sword, and this is the only time that any Zizzle Will Turner figure is included with a pistol, which is sculpted and painted quite nicely. This is without a doubt the best one. I think it looks the most like him, and I love the outfit that he wears in At World's End, and this figure represents it quite well. The only downside to this figure is, for whatever reason, they didn't sculpt his sheath where you could put the sword on the inside. Despite that one flaw, this is definitely my favorite of the Will Turner figures. This is the one I played with the most as a kid, and this is definitely the most piratey looking of Will Turner outfits. Last but not least, that brings us to Last Stand Will Turner. This is one of the top 3 rarest of the Pirates of the Caribbean Zizzle figures. Similar to the Deluxe Will Turner, though this time around he is sporting a black jacket. Accessory-wise, he includes the same sword, and he comes with Bootstrap Bill's dagger. Once again, another accessory that the Secrets of the Deep Will Turner figure came with. Overall, this is a fantastic figure. Once again, it is extremely rare. I've seen it go to $80 to $100. Which is why I'm keeping him on card. This figure's staying in the box. Look at the very back right here. And here are some of the other last wave of At World's End figures, such as Human Davy Jones, Jack Sparrow from Davy Jones' Locker. All of these figures are rather sought after, especially Lord Cutler Beckett. This figure is also exclusive to the UK. It was never released over here in the United States. So unfortunately, I never had this one as a kid. And I actually paid quite a bit for it, but it was worth every penny. Definitely one of the holy grails of my Pirates of the Caribbean collection. And that wraps it up. That is every single Zizzle Pirates of the Caribbean Will Turner action figure. Besides Jack Sparrow, he was the most produced character in this line. Next review, I'll probably cover Elizabeth Swann, as she was probably 3rd in line as the most produced Pirates of the Caribbean character. And as I stated in my Jack Sparrow figure review, this is going to be a review series where I'll just cover it by character or by request. If there's a specific Pirates of the Caribbean Zizzle action figure you would like to be reviewed, I own most, if not all of them, so feel free to comment down below.